بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Now we know the minimum days for Haydh is 3 and the maximum is 10, and there should be a 15-day separation from one cycle to the other. Also, we talked about that it doesn't have to be continuous, which means it's possible to see blood, then it stops, and then you see it in spots. فإذا انقطع دم الحيض لأقل من 10 أيام لم يجوز وطئها حتى تغتسل أو يمضي عليها وقت صلاة كاملة، وإن انقطع دمها ل10 أيام جاز وطئها قبل الغسل. So when the menses cease in less than 10 days, right, then sexual intercourse is still not permitted until she takes a bath, or when at the time of a complete prayer has passed by her. Because we know that the maximum period is 10 days, so it's possible though the blood might stop at the 7th day, but it's still possible that it might start flowing again, right? So we don't know exactly when she needs to stop her cycle and when she should start praying. So as a precaution, of waiting and making sure that she's actually exited the cycle, the fuqaha have suggested one of two things. Either she takes a bath, and when she's done with the bath, we'll say that enough time has passed, that if she were still in her cycle, she should have bled, or that she waits long enough that the time of an entire salah passes by. So, for example, if the blood stops at dhuhr, then she waits until the dhuhr becomes qala, until asr starts. And this will be an indication that her cycle has now officially ended and she can now perform all those acts of ibadats that she couldn't before. She can have relations with her husband that she couldn't in this time period. Now, the important thing to notice is that in this part of the passage, he only described that she cannot have intercourse until either the time of the entire salah passes or that she takes a bath. He hasn't mentioned anything about reciting the Quran. Obviously, she can't pray because she needs to have ghusl before she can do that. But the recitation of the Quran itself does not require you to be in a state of purity. He doesn't mention anything of that. The reason being, if she has a particular habit, an aada in her cycle, let's say that her habit is her cycle usually lasts 7 days, and she's reached 7 days, right? Although the possibility does exist that it might extend up to 10 days, but 7 days were her habit. Now, when she reaches 7, he says that it's allowed for her to recite the Quran. Why? Because she's completed her aada, her cycle, and 9 out of 10 times when she reaches the maximum that her established cycle is, she's not going to exceed it. So this allows for her to initiate her acts of ibadah. But as far as intercourse is concerned, because it has more significance to the fact that the damages done during that time might be greater. In order to prevent that, taking on caution is the best approach. And so that's why either you have to need some sort of indication to tell you that the time's actually up and you can start living your life like you used to. And so that's why he mentions it in such a way. And again, like I mentioned, this is when the blood actually stopped at the ada that she had, at the habit that she had, 7 in our example. If it stops before that, let's say it stopped at day 5, right? Then in this case, although it's possible that the habit could have changed, that possibility remains. So let's say it stops at day 5. She bathes, the time of the salah passes, then she can resume her fasts, she can resume her salah, but still relations with her husband must be kept at bay until she reaches the point of aada, which is 7 days. And then afterwards, she can start with those relations as well, right? On the other hand, in قطع دمها لعشرة أيام, that if her period bleeding continues up to 10 days and after 10 days it stops, then even before doing ghusl, she can have relations with her husband. Why? Because we know 10 is the maximum. She cannot exceed 10 days. So there's no possible chance of her getting back into a cycle when the 10-day time limit has been reached. And so those indicators that we needed, either bathing or either the passing of an entire time period of a salah, they're no longer required because she's reached the maximum limit that there is. Although it is mustahab that she does take a bath, not actually mustahab, it's actually wajib that she takes a bath because one of the times when bathing becomes wajib is when a woman exits from her cycle or from postnatal bleeding. وإن انقطع دمها ل10 أيام جاز وضوءها قبل الغسل والطهر إذا تخلل بين الدمين في مدة الحيض فهو كالدم الجاري. Now he talks about al-tuhr al-mutakhallil. That is the period of purity that intervenes between two separate bleedings, right? And he mentions that this period of tuhr between two bleedings is like continuous bleeding, as if this entire period she was bleeding. So it'll be like part of Haydh, right? In other words, what they're trying to say is in order for her cycle to be considered as her menstruation, it doesn't have to encompass the entire 10 days or wherever Ada is. It doesn't need to cover all 10 days. You don't have to bleed all 10 days to say that this was your cycle, right? If you see it at the start and you see it at the end, that's pretty much sufficient enough. It doesn't matter if it was less than 3 days, but if it's as long as it is in that established cycle. So, for example, if a woman on the first day she sees blood, 8 days she doesn't see it, on the ninth day she sees it again. All these 9 days will be considered as her hayd. Or maybe she saw only blood for an hour or so, a moment in time. Then 9 days passed, she saw nothing, and on the 10th day she again sees bleeding. This entire thing will be considered as her cycle. Similarly, for example, if she sees bleeding for 2 days, then 7 days she sees purification. And on the 10th day again, she sees bleeding. So the entire period will be considered as her cycle. Take another case. 3 days she sees blood. 6 days she sees tuhur. and on the 10th day, she again sees blood. All 10 days will be considered as part of her cycle. So one day she sees blood, 6 days she sees tuhur, and 3 day she sees blood again. Again, all of these 10 days will be considered as her cycle. So you see, when we mentioned that the minimum of Hayd is like 3 days, so it does not mean that those 3 days must be continuous bleeding. If she bleeds in a 10-day cycle at the first and the last day, anything in between, even if there was no bleeding, will be considered as if she was bleeding. So it'll be part of her cycle. So that's what he mentioned, that a purity period, which intervenes two bleedings, that is like continuous bleeding. It will be part of her cycle. And then وأقل طهر 15 يوما ولا غاية لأكثره. And the minimum period of purity between two cycles is 15 days, and there's no limit for the maximum period. So it's possible that she might not have a period again for years and years and on. So that possibility exists. But there should be at least a minimum of 15 days between two cycles. If one cycle is passed and she sees bleeding again within 15 days, that will not be her new cycle. That will not be considered hayd. It will be considered as istihada. Or if she sees bleeding less than 3 days or more than 10 days, then it's also istihada. It's like chronic menstrual bleeding. So such a person is treated as a normal person. The ahkam of hayd that we've discussed, of not reciting the Quran, not entering the mosque, not making the tawaf, not having relations with her husband, not touching the Quran, all of these things, they don't apply to her. Right? So the difference in quality between damul istihada is that it's red and it's less viscous than damul hayd. Also, it doesn't have a stench to it. As for damul hayd, it's actually thick. It has a foul odor to it, and it's not like blood, the color of pure blood. It's usually black or brown in nature, a lot dark, a lot denser than normal blood is, which you might see from if you cut your finger or something. So, ما تراه المرأة أقل من 3 أيام. If she sees bleeding for less than 3 days, then all of it will be considered istihada. So supposedly she sees bleeding on the first day, on the second day. Now, in the next 10 days, she doesn't see anything. So we know that the maximum cycle is 10 days, right? So in the next 10 days, she doesn't see anything, which means that the first 2 days could not have been hayd because it did not meet the minimum requirement of having 3 days. Now we can only consider it as continuous bleeding if at the start and the end of the cycle she sees blood. But at the end of the cycle, or at the end of the 10 days, she's not seeing anything. So we cannot consider this to be hayd. This will be istihada. Similarly, if bleeding starts in her established period, let's say on the 11th of every month, she has her cycle. Until 21st, she's bleeding, and on 22nd, again, she's still seeing blood. So, the maximum days can be 10. Anything after 10 cannot be istihada. But there's a difference here. The woman who's been bleeding more than 10 days, how much of this bleeding will be considered hayd, will be part of her cycle, and how much will it be istihada? Well, it depends. If she already has an established ada, let's say that her ada was again 7 days, right? And now she's been continuously bleeding for 11 days. We were going to say that her ada was 7. So up till 7, it was Hayd, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th. These days will then be istihada, which means for these 4 days, she'll have to make up for the salah that she has missed. Any sawm, any fast that she has missed, she'll make the qada of that as well. But if someone has started bleeding for the first time and their bleeding exceeds the 10-day cycle, let's say it entered the 11th day. So for such a person, the complete first 10 days will be part of her cycle. And from the 11th day, istihada will begin because you can't exceed from 10 days. And because this was the first time, she has no established ada, so all 10 will be considered as part of the hayd. Another question about the changing of the cycle. So the cycle doesn't change just at by just once. I mean, it has to happen at least 2 times consecutively. So in our example, she had a cycle of 7 days. Let's say that the next month she sees bleeding of 8 days, right? And then it stops. We're not going to say that her cycle stopped. We'll say it was 7 days. She'll have to make the qada on the 8th day. Obviously, when she's seeing blood, she will stop herself from praying because the possibility does exist that something has changed. This might transform into something else. But if it stops, we will say that this one day was istihaza. And in the next month, she repeats the same habit. I mean, her blood does not stop at 7, which was her previous cycle, actually goes up till 8. Now, on the second month, we're going to say that her ada, that her habit has changed from 7 to 8. And now 8 will be her new threshold for the istihada. But if on the second month she doesn't see 8, she sees 6 or she sees 9, right? Then her previous ada of 7 days will remain intact. And that will be the threshold, or that will be the point from which we will judge all the ahkam. So on the ruling of menstrual bleeding, فحكمه حكم الرعاة لا يمنع الصلاة ولا الصوم ولا الوتر. The ruling of istihaza is the same as that of a nosebleed, a chronic nosebleed. It does not prevent prayer, fast, or sexual intercourse. وإذا زاد الدم على 10 and the bleeding exceeds 10 days, وللمرأة عادة معروفة, but the woman has a known cycle of menstruation and purity. So let's say she bleeds only 7 days a month from the 11th to the 18th, then starts on the 11th of the next month. So this is her cycle that's known. So if it exceeds 10 days, she refers to the days of her cycle. That 7 will be the cutoff of Haydh, and anything after that will be istihada. وإن ابتدأت بالبلوغ مع البلوغ مستحاضة, if a minor commenced her puberty in the state of istihada, going above 10 days, فحيضها 10 أيام من كل شهر, her menses are 10 days of each month, and the remaining will be istihada. And for the one who from puberty is always in a state of istihada, she has always been bleeding, her cycle will be 10 days of Haydh, 15 days of istihada, then 10 days of Haydh again. Because you need a 15-day period between the next Haydh. المستحاضة ومن به سلس البول والرعاف الدائم والجرح الذي لا يرقى يتوضؤون لكل صلاة ويصلون بذلك الوضوء في الوقت ما شاء من الفرائض والنوافل. The woman experiencing istihada, someone who suffers from urinary inconsistency, when they're continuously urinating, they can't stop, a continuous flow, nosebleed, or a wound that does not cease. I mean, it's bleeding, it doesn't stop. In short, any condition in which a person experiences some form of impurity which does not cease for an entire period of a complete salah. Such a person is considered to be ma'dhur in Sharia. Ma'dhur are excused because they're in a situation in which they can't help themselves, right? So the ahkam of such people are different from normal people. Now, when we're talking about ma'dhur, the excused, we need to first establish what is an udhr, what it takes to sustain an udhr, and when will someone's udhr or their excuse be considered invalid, or let's say, in other words, when is a person no longer excused? So the first question, when an udhr is established, the time for an entire salah must pass in that specific state without finding enough time to make wudu and then completing your 4 units of prayer. So, for example, if someone they start bleeding at the time of dhuhr and until the time of asr, they cannot find enough time to be able to make wudu and pray, which means that for the entirety of the time, at different intervals, they're bleeding or they're having gastric problems or urinating and they can't stop. And it encompasses the entire time in which they cannot find enough time to be able to achieve purity and pray. Dhuhr. Then once Asr begins, such a person will be considered excused. Right? Now they've become ma'dhur. Now obviously, if we were to say that this is the condition for the udhr perpetually, it will become extremely difficult. You'll always be in this state of mind of being continuously trying to figure out whether or not the udhr exists for the second time or not. So once the udhr has been established, once the entire salah period has elapsed without having found the time to make wudu and pray, for the next salawat that are to come, you don't have to wait the entire time. If you see that condition, you see that impurity, even just once, that person will still be considered as being excused. So from Asr to Maghrib, let's say you only bled once, right? You'll still be considered as being excused. Same goes for every other salah that is to come. Now the third question is, when does this excuse actually finish? The criteria is the same as that of becoming excused, which means that if the entirety of one salah time frame passes without being inflicted with an impurity, then such a person is no longer excused. So let's say next day, Maghrib starts and a person is not seeing any impurity, and the entire Maghrib passes, they see nothing, and Isha begins without having bled once, without having a gastric discharge once, without having urinated once, or any other sort of impurity. Such a person is now no longer excused, and his ahkam will shift to those of normal people once again. So these are the three phases: when a person becomes excused, how the excuse continues, and when the excuse ends. Now, what is the different hukum that such people have? Well, يتوضؤون لوقت كل صلاة. They have to make a new wuzu for the time of every prayer. So when Dhuhr begins, the time of Dhuhr begins, they have to make a new wuzu. When the time of Asr begins, they have to make a new wudu. In other words, let's say whenever the time of a new salah enters, their old wudu becomes nullified and they have to make a new wudu. But with that one wudu, when they made in Dhuhr, they can pray as many nawafil as they want, as many qada salawat as they want. They can recite the Quran with that. They can make as many sujood as they want with that one wuzu. But for each new time, they're going to have to make a new wudu. فإذا خرج الوقت, and when the time period of a salah exits, بطل وضوءهم, their wuzu becomes invalid. وكان عليهم استئناف الوضوء لصلاة أخرى, they're going to have to make a new wuzu that's wajib on them for the next salah. So damul istihaza is one of those excuses, right? It's not normal menses. It doesn't have the ahkam of the menses. So basically, an excuse person, in all other things, they're the same, except for them making wudu, because for them, they have to make it for every new time, the time of every new salah. As far as the rest of the ahkam are concerned, uh, they are the same as normal people, except for the fact that they don't have to wash their clothes, or they don't have to make it wajib upon them to wash their clothes all the time, because of this, the problem that they're facing. It'll be extremely difficult to keep up with continuous washing of the clothes whenever they're soiled. So that's the second exception that they have from normal people, that they don't have to make sure to wash away all the filth from their body or clothes before commencing prayer or reciting the Quran or anything else, because for them it's an excuse, it's continuously happening, they can't control over it, and forcing them to actually clean up all the time is going to be uh, extremely difficult. وَلَيْسَ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ, and there's no difficulty or no compulsion beyond uh, a person's capability in Sharia. Now let's talk about nifas, or postnatal bleeding. والنفاس هو الدم الخارج عقب الولادة، والدم الذي تراه الحامل وما تراه المرأة في حال ولادتها قبل خروج الولد استحاضة. So postnatal bleeding is the blood that emerges following childbirth. So after the child has been born or has started exiting uh, the mother's vaginal canal, that blood is postnatal bleeding. So any blood that a pregnant woman sees, that cannot be hayd. Similarly, if it's the beginning of her delivery before the child actually emerges, any blood that the mother sees, that is not nifas, that will be istihada. Why? Because once she becomes pregnant, the mouth of the womb closes up. And we know that hayd or nifas is the blood that comes out of the womb. Once the mouth of the womb is closed, blood can't exit. All of that blood transforms into a food source for the fetus. So any blood that she's seeing in the state of pregnancy cannot be hayd. It must be coming from somewhere else other than the womb. So that's why it's istihada. Similarly, until the child emerges, we'll consider the womb to be closed. And so the blood she sees when she's going into delivery, but the child hasn't emerged yet, will still be considered as coming from somewhere other than the womb itself. So that can't be nifas either. So any blood she sees during her pregnancy, during the period of childbirth, before actually the child coming out of her, all of this will be considered istihala. That's the first thing. وأقل النفاس لا حد له وأكثره 40 يوما وما زاد على ذلك فهو استحاذة. There is no minimum amount of time for nifas. In Haydh, you had at the minimum 3 days in order to establish that was Haydh. But in nifas, there is no minimum amount. It can happen even one day. There could be a nifas of one day. There could be a nifas of 2 days. That's also possible. But the maximum limit that you have is 40 days. وَمَا زَادَ عَلَى ذَلك. If it exceeds 40, then it will be considered istihada. But anything less than 40, that will be nifas. What happens if she exceeds 40 days? وإذا تجاوز الدم على 40. If the bleeding extends beyond 40 days, وقد كانت هذه المرأة ولدت قبل ذلك ولها عادة في النفاس, and this woman has already given birth before, and she already has an established عادة in nifas. Let's say it's 26 days, right? ردت إلى أيام عادتها. Then now we'll say that at 26 it was nifas, and after 26 all of this was istihada. So she'll have to make up for the prayers of those missed days, 14 days that she's missed. وَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ لَهَا عَادَةٌ. But if she doesn't have an ada, she doesn't have a regular cycle for nifas, it's the first time she's giving birth, فَنِفَاسُهَا 40 يوما. So 40 days will be her nifas, just like for the woman who just now had her first cycle. If it exceeds 10 days, then the maximum limit 10 will be her cycle, after which it will cease. Similarly, the one giving birth the first time, 40 days will be her cycle. After that, all of it is istihada. Now we know when she is pregnant, the mouth of the womb closes. So blood coming before that is istihada. But what if she has twins? She's having twins. So the question is nifas the blood that comes or that follows the first child? Or is it the one that follows the second child? So, وَمَنْ وَلَدْ وَلَدَيْنِ فِي بَطْنٍ وَاحِدٍ. Whoever gives birth to twins in one pregnancy. فنفاسها ما خرج من الدم عقيب الولد الأول عند أبي حنيفة ويوسف رحمه الله. According to the Shaykhain, Abu Hanifa wa Abu Yusuf rahimahumullah ta'ala, the blood that follows the first child is considered as nifas. Why? Because once the first child comes out, the mouth of the womb actually opens up, which means the blood that flows afterwards will be part, is coming from the womb. So it can easily be judged as being blood of nifas. وقال محمد وزفر رحمه الله تعالى. But Imam Muhammad and Imam Zufar, they suggest that it's actually the blood that follows the second child, which is considered as nifas. And they say the reason why is that after giving birth to the first, she's still pregnant, right? And The definition of nifas was blood that follows after pregnancy. After giving birth to the first, she's still pregnant. So that's why the blood cannot be nifas, it must be istihada. And after she's done completing giving birth to the second as well, then the blood that will flow will be nifas. And that is why the reason that if, for example, a woman in her pregnancy was divorced or that her husband passed away, her idda ends when she's given birth to the second child. If she was having twins, her idda ends only when she gives birth to the second child. So that's another indication of the fact that it's the second child that should be considered, right? In all ahkam, in nifas, in idda, and in whatever not. But the Shaykhain, Abu Hanifa wa Abu Yusuf rahimahullah ta'ala, they say that the only reason why we defined nifas as the blood that follows childbirth is for the fact that during pregnancy, the mouth of the womb closes up and blood can no longer flow from it. And that only opens after she gives birth. And in case of twins, the mouth of the womb actually opens after the birth of the first one. And so that's why the blood that comes from it can be considered nifas. So the definition was basically based on the fact that generally a woman gives birth to one child at a time. Keeping that in mind, the definition was considered. The real hikmah behind it, or the real underlying cause, is actually the opening of the womb, which is to be considered, which actually does happen when we talk about twins. So it happens at the first one. And so that's why that person will be considered as the one who follows from whom follows the iddah.